Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know how much we love getting into the weeds when it comes to tech and thinking critically, right? And well, today we're really diving into something I think you'll find fascinating, especially with your interest in making sure you're not being tricked by just too much stuff online. You ever get that feeling that just because you've seen something online, like everywhere, that it just has to be true?
It's like it's been repeated enough times that it must be right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, get ready to unpack this whole idea of cognitive ease and really explore how it can make things fuzzy,
Yeah.
where things being familiar and things being accurate. It's not always the same thing, and it can be hard to tell the difference, especially on platforms like LinkedIn.
Yeah, it is interesting how our brains are kind of hardwired to want to do things the easiest way possible, especially in this world, which is so much information coming at us all the time.
Right.
But this natural tendency we have, well, we'll see how it can be used against us in a way,
Oh, absolutely.
which makes it even more important to really work on those critical thinking skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to use a really thought-provoking blog post to help guide us today. It's called Why Critical Thinking Matters: Unpacking the Paranoia of LinkedIn.
Okay.
And it's by Wicho Science. He's the voice behind the podcast Tech Chronicles with Miss Green and Mr. Belly. Speaking of which, Sans just wrapped up his first season with a really fascinating kind of observation. He was saying how important it is to really go deep on these tech topics instead of just, kind of skimming the surface.
Yeah.
Sound familiar?
Definitely highlights what we're trying to do with these deep dives, all right?
Yeah.
We're all about, like you said, not just reading the headlines and actually trying to understand all the complicated stuff underneath.
Exactly. And that's what makes Sands's blog post so relevant. He argues that while LinkedIn can be awesome, it can be a really good tool for networking and sharing ideas, it's also like a breeding ground for this phenomenon we're about to unpack, cognitive ease. Basically, it's just our brains liking information that's easy to process, which, isn't always the most reliable information.
Exactly. Our brains love those shortcuts. Like if something feels familiar, if it's not a lot of brain work to think about it, we're much more likely to just accept it as the truth. Like it's like a mental energy saver mode or something.
Oh, okay, so that makes sense. But how does that actually play out in real life? Science uses a pretty funny example. Something about chickens.
He does.
And
So imagine someone always hearing that a chicken's body temperature is 34 degrees Celsius.
okay.
Now, that's not right at all. A chicken's body temperature is actually closer to 41 degrees.
Wow. Okay.
But just hearing it over and over again, that constant repetition, can make that wrong information feel more believable just because it becomes familiar.
Wow, it's like our brains are saying, well, I've heard that a bunch, so it's got to be true.
Exactly.
It gets even crazier, though. Science talks about a study where researchers tested this idea using totally made-up words. And get this. The words were kriga and bonjinai.
It's like a whole made-up language.
Right.
I love it.
So they put these nonsensical words into student newspapers just randomly. And the words that showed up more, you guess it, were rated as more likable, even though they meant absolutely nothing.
Just because they were familiar.
It's wild. So even gibberish can become I don't know, appealing if we just see it enough times. It's like our brains think that if something's familiar, it must be good, even if it makes no sense. And this doesn't just apply to made-up words, right? Sains connects this to celebrity culture and mentions a group called Los Derbez. Are you familiar with them?
I am, yeah. They're a family of entertainers from Mexico, and they actually get a lot of criticism for being, well, famous for being famous.
Mm.
And this ties right into what Sains is saying.
It's like that saying, I don't know why, but I just don't like that person. Maybe it's not so much about disliking them as it is about not having that familiarity.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about like or dislike. It's more like our brains just haven't made that connection of, oh, yeah, I know that. So it's just sort of neutral, or maybe even a little negative because we don't know it. But when you see someone like Los Derbez everywhere, like their movies and TV shows and all over social media, that familiarity can make you feel like, oh, yeah, they're all right. Or even like you really like them, even if you don't actually know anything about their talent or what they've done.
It's like our brains are thinking in the background, well, they're everywhere, so they must be doing something right.
Exactly.
It's kind of cool, but also a little creepy, especially when you think about how this cognitive ease thing, this mental shortcut, could be messing with how we see other things in life, too.
Oh, absolutely, it does. Science even says that just the way information looks visually can use this cognitive ease thing. Like studies show that people are more likely to think something's true if it's in bold letters compared to if it was in italics or really hard to read font.
So just making something bold can make people believe it more. I guess it kind of makes sense. It's easier to read, easier on the eyes, so our brains think it must be true.
Exactly. And it goes beyond fonts, too. There's research that says that companies with names that are easy to say actually do better in the stock market. It sounds kind of crazy, but that easiness, that fluency, can really change our decisions, even about money.
Okay, now that makes me a little worried. It's one thing if we start to like a made-up word just because we've heard it a few times, but if you're saying that something as simple as bold text or a company's name can actually make us think something's true or even change how we invest our money, that's kind of scary. What does that even mean for thinking critically, especially online, where everyone and everything is fighting for our attention?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's exactly why what science is talking about with this whole critical thinking thing is so important, especially on LinkedIn. If you think about it, LinkedIn is all about sharing and repeating information, usually just with people in our own little work bubbles. This creates what we call an echo chamber, where ideas that we already agree with get repeated over and over again, which makes them feel even more right, even if they're based on bad logic or not enough information.
Right. And this is where liking something familiar and trusting something accurate becomes a real problem. We start believing things not because we've really thought about them, but just because we keep seeing them over and over again in our own little online worlds. So how do we get out of this loop? How do we become smarter about the information we take in, especially online?
Well, science actually talks about this study with logic puzzles that I think gives us a clue. In this study, they gave people the same puzzles, but some got them in a really clear, easy-to-read font, and others got them in this cursive that was harder to read.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
You probably know what's coming next.
The cursive group had a harder time, but did that actually change how they did on the puzzles?
It did. The people who had to put in a little more effort, who had to actually work their brains a bit because of that cursive, did better. They made fewer mistakes and were better at solving the puzzles.
So struggling a little actually made them more accurate. It seems strange, but I guess it shows how powerful desirable difficulty is. Like in psychology, they talk about this, where if we're forced to slow down and really think about something, we don't fall for those mental shortcuts as easily.
Exactly. It's like working out your brain. The more we push ourselves to really think critically about information, question what we believe, and look for different points of view, the better we get at avoiding these thinking traps.
So it's not about being suspicious of everything we see online, but about having a healthy dose of doubt, right? Like recognizing that our brains like to take the easy way out, and sometimes that means sacrificing accuracy.
Right. It's about finding that balance between trusting your gut and really using those critical thinking skills. Asking ourselves, why am I seeing this? Where did this information come from? Is this just something I've heard a million times in my own little bubble? Or do I actually believe this based on facts and thinking it through?
And that seems especially important on a platform like LinkedIn, where it can be hard to tell the difference between people building their personal brands, networking for their careers, and actually sharing real information. It's almost like LinkedIn is this big experiment for how good we are at thinking critically, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly seeing all these perfect-looking profiles and people acting like experts and updates about our industries. It's like all of it is trying to grab our attention and make us agree with it.
It's true. And while there's nothing wrong with, trying to look good online or sharing what, it's important to remember that everything online, especially on a place like LinkedIn, has a lot of different filters on it. People trying to build their brands, companies trying to push their own ideas, and even our own weird brain biases.
Right. So how do we balance liking things that are familiar, which, let's be real, makes being online easier, with actually doing the hard work of critical thinking?
I think it all starts with just being aware of these things. Just knowing about these cognitive biases, knowing how our brains try to take the easy way out can make a huge difference. Like next time you see some big headline that agrees with what you already believe, just stop for a second and ask yourself, am I only interested in this because it makes me feel smart or because it's actually true?
It's like that saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Right.
On social media, a lot of times we're paying with our attention, and our attention is being controlled by all these little cues and biases.
And that's what makes that last thought from Science so powerful. He asks, how can we balance liking familiar things with needing to think critically in this digital world we live in? It's a tough question with no easy answers, but it's something we should all be thinking about, especially as things online keep getting more and more complicated.
And it goes way beyond just LinkedIn, don't you think? It's about how we interact with the news and social media and even how we decide what's true or not in our own careers.
Totally. The point isn't to make you paranoid or make you distrust everything online. It's about having a healthy amount of skepticism,
Hmm.
you know, like being aware of how our own minds work so we could be smarter and more careful and, in the end, more in control when we're online.
So to kind of wrap up our deep dive here, it seems like the first step in fighting back against misinformation online is actually understanding how our own brains work.
Yeah.
We have to recognize those mental shortcuts, those times when we want to take the easy way out, even if it means we might be wrong.
Exactly. And once we know about those tendencies, we can actually start to fight back against them. Like by actively looking for different viewpoints and questioning what we believe and being open to the idea that we might be wrong sometimes, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Because like we learned today, sometimes those moments where we have to really think hard, those times when we can't just coast on autopilot are actually the best for us. It's like we're building mental muscle one carefully thought out thought at a time.
Well said. It's about enjoying that process of always learning and questioning.
And speaking of learning and questioning, I want to thank you for another great deep dive. Hopefully you all listening got something valuable out of this and maybe have a few new things to think about as you're online. Until next time, stay curious.